Well, I was always interested in media, kind of at a time when there were not a lot of programs, not a lot of film programs in universities, but interested in media and theater and film and television. And I kind of fell into documentaries in that a friend of mine was executive director of an organization that had development projects in Africa. And I was working with Simply Akabovich and another group of people, and we were actually trying to put get a feature film off the ground. And this friend suggested that we do a documentary on development projects in Africa. What works, what doesn't work, and we thought, that sounds interesting, and we just picked it up and decided to start developing it. And we ended up getting that documentary funded. And at the time, the internet kind of didn't exist, certainly not for the mass public. There were no cell phones, there were no faxes. So a lot of the research had to be done on location in Africa. So we would set off to travel there and know that there was an organization in Malawi or Uganda that we were going to film, but we had to interview people on location to decide if they were appropriate for the film or not. So that was my first taste of making documentaries, and we flew in, we traveled across Africa on 2 trips, one for 6 weeks and one for 7 weeks, winging it all the time, going to villages, figuring out transportation, meeting people that we would never have met otherwise. And that's when I really fell in love with making documentaries and realizing that, one, it involved travel to great locations. And I don't mean great in terms of great fun, but just more obscure places, places that are off the beaten path, meeting people that you would never meet even if you were on vacation in any of these countries. And the idea that we were able to bring these stories to a general public was very, very appealing. So that was the film that got me started. Most of the time, the ideas to make a film either come to me from a newspaper article or from my own personal interest. But in the case of Sex Slaves, it was because I encountered women who were trafficked working on another production. I was working on a 3-part series with Penn and Teller, the American comedian magicians, about street magic in Egypt, India, and China. And we were filming in China. There's fantastic indigenous magic in China. And we were in a deep in a rural area, and I travel ahead of the crew and ahead of Penn and Teller, trying to figure out not only who we're going to interview and what we're going to film, but the logistics. Where are we going to stay? How are we going to sleep? How are we going to eat? And this was so deeply rural. We feared there would be no hotels, and we might have to rent an apartment if we could find one and furnish it so that we'd have a place to stay. And when I arrived, I was surprised to find a hotel that was kind of like, felt like a Holiday Inn kind of, looking hotel. And it was really incongruous to see a hotel like that in the area, but I was very, very happy because it made my logistical life easier. And when I came back and checked in with Penn and Teller and the crew, we were shocked to discover that the reason the hotel was there is because it was a brothel. And in the basement of this hotel was a discotheque, and we went down to check it out, and there was a sea of Chinese prostitutes and 2 blonde women who were there. And we were curious, what are these blonde white women doing there? We went to talk to them, and my co-producer, Felix Golubov, is Russian speaking, and they were Russian, and we asked, what are you doing here? And they said, well, we were recruited here by a Russian-speaking Chinese pimp, and we thought we were going to be cleaning hotel rooms, working as domestics, cleaning hotel rooms, but they took our passports, and they've been moving us from brothel to brothel in the interior of China. And we asked, what can we do to help? I mean, our immediate reaction is, how can we help? And should we call the police? And they said, you can't call the police use our services. And we were unable to do anything to help them. And we went on shooting our shoot, but we kept thinking about these women and how impotent we were to help them. And we called the hotel back a couple of weeks later, and they were already gone. And when we finished that production and came back to Canada, I started looking into, what is this? Is this one particular case, and learned that trafficking of women has gone on forever, but that the new it girls in the world of trafficking were women from former Soviet republics. there's unbelievable poverty in those countries and hopelessness, and they're easily recruited to go overseas because they're all looking for work. And that's when I started trying to raise the money and do more research to see how I can tell that story. Well, making Sex Slaves was really challenging because it was an investigative film, and it was the first time that I was going to do something that was undercover, that involved hidden cameras and really doing an undercover investigation. And the reason that I went that route is because I felt it was the only way to really tell that story, because I had seen some pieces on trafficking, and often they would interview someone after they had gone through it, and despite the fact that their stories were devastating, you didn't really feel the emotion. You felt bad, but you didn't really understand, how does this trafficking world work? How do they con these women into going overseas? Why don't these women run away? I had all these questions that I wanted answered, and I figured the only way to do it is to really try and get inside that world. So for the first time, I did several development trips, which you usually don't have the luxury of doing in documentaries, but there was no other way for me to kind of suss out that world and see where I thought I could get access. And Ukraine and Moldova seemed to be the center where most of the women were trafficked from. And we just spent a lot of time there, got to know the police force, got to know a little bit of the underworld, and then, you know, partially luck, partially serendipity, and partially hard work. I mean, that's what it's always like when you make a documentary. For anyone who makes a documentary, you have to a little bit be in the right place at the right time, but also really kind of gain the trust of the people who work in that world so you can get in there. And ended up following several stories. Not all of them made it into the film, but we met this one man whose wife was sold by an acquaintance in Turkey, and he wanted to go back and try and get her back by posing as a pimp. And we felt that that would be a great story to follow. And that was really the spine of the Sex Slaves film. The truth is, people always ask me, what kind of documentaries do you like doing? And I you know, half jokingly say I do films on sex and death. But but it's partially true. I mean, I'm drawn to particular stories, and it's hard to explain why you're drawn to them. Like I said, for Sex Slaves, I had an encounter with women who were trafficked and then realized this is a story I want to tell. Some of the stuff I've done is lighter, not all of it is investigative in nature, but I did a film on the Ebola outbreak in Zaire in the 90s because, again, I thought that was a very, very compelling story of something that was happening far away from us, but something that made the news. I think that the beauty of making documentaries like this is you really get to bring these stories home to a Western audience. I mean, it sounds a little bit corny and predictable to say that, but it's true, because otherwise we get bits and pieces of that in the news. And the way I think you touch people is by having them meet characters and understand the characters' lives and what motivates them. And it makes for a very powerful document of what's going on. And documentaries have always been useful for social change and bringing those stories and putting these kinds of stories on the agenda in our own countries. And now more than ever, the media does that. The media plays a role. It plays a role in wars now. It plays a role in social issues. And that is very appealing, because it means you can tell a little story, but you can reach a huge audience and you can make a little bit of difference. We're all complainers. We always whine about difficulties in funding and distribution and getting our stories to the screen. And of course that's true in every case, for every kind of story, even in feature films. But I think in many ways, while there are challenges, we are lucky to a certain extent. We tend to, because we get tax credits and some element of government funding, even though that's being cut, we still have the upper hand to many countries who don't. The challenge, I think, now is that the kind of feature-length doc or one-off doc on a social or political issue, it's just tough to fund because there aren't as many venues. Having said that, 15 years ago, there were less venues. I mean, reality television, those kinds of genres are taking off and audiences like them. So we've always had to kind of find the right pocket and the right venue for our kind of film. And it's always a struggle. Budgets are tough to raise. Doing films that are in foreign countries, which is kind of largely what I've been doing, just require larger budgets than films that are shot at home. But I still think we're at an advantage because we have support. We have support from entities like Rogers. We do have government support. Having said that, it's getting tougher and tougher. And I think that we have to become more inventive in our financing. And that's starting to happen with programs like Kickstarter. People are looking at different ways of raising money, different ways of getting the story out. But in a way, that's in its infancy. And we still rely on broadcaster-driven documentaries, by and large, to raise our funding. And I think that model is going to change over the next few years, and we all have to figure out how to shift with the change. I mean, when I started making documentaries, I shouldn't say this because it'll indicate how old I am, there was one documentary strand in Canada on CBC. There simply weren't that many channels, and they weren't running documentaries. And if you didn't sell to this one strand, then you couldn't make your documentary. So we've come a long way since then. So even though every few years there's a shift, a seismic shift, and our funding model changes, you know, I think most documentarians are able to kind of change with the times and figure it out. I think when I was first contacted by Cinema Politica about sex slaves, I hadn't heard about the organization. Since then, I hear about it all the time, and I'm seeing screenings at different theaters. And from minute one, the minute I spoke with Ezra and Svetla, I was completely impressed by not only how professional they were, but how committed they were and how passionate they were. I went to Montreal for a screening of the film, and I love them on site, and I think I'm not the only one who feels that way. But I also think that they very smartly have found a particular niche in the documentary market that makes a difference, because there's social political documentaries people love them, but there's often, once they're on television, there's not a lot of opportunity to see them. People have to seek them out. Where do you find them? And Cinema Politica has really kind of filled this gap and has developed audiences and has developed a following that knows that they're going to program solid films about important issues. And I think they're growing as a force in Canada. It's really nice to see.